Hello and welcome to the 8th webinar by Search for Common Ground on countering violent extremism. In this video, we'll explore the role of narratives and media in violent extremism, as well as our efforts to counter them. We want to begin by asking you to think of an experience from your own life when a political, religious, or ethical view changed. Go ahead and think about it for a second, and as you think of an example, ask yourself, what were the elements that made that change happen? Go ahead and pause the video if you need more time to think or perhaps to share with someone else. So as we think about our own lives and times when our own perspectives changed in even dramatic ways, we have to realize that these experiences often didn't happen simply because we read something in a book or heard something, but often because there were a lot of other elements at play. In countering violent extremism, these kinds of attitudes or beliefs are what we refer to as narratives. Now, narratives as we define them are a set of ideas, facts, perspectives, and experiences that really inform the way an individual or group perceives their place in the world around them. Now, narratives blend elements of historical truth with constructed storylines, either storylines that we produce ourselves or perhaps that are constructed by societies around us. Narratives can resonate deeply with a person or a group's sense of self and how they make sense of events in their own lives. Now, narratives can be positive or negative, and they really just function as a natural part of our human experience. In countering violent extremism, we understand that violent narratives, these negative narratives, can be promoted by violent extremist ideologies and groups. And indeed, they can be very skilled at creating narratives that end up dividing communities and encouraging men and women to become radicalized or even to join their groups. However, we also know that narratives can be positive, and that we can use our understanding of how people make sense of the world around them to make positive narratives that reduce vulnerability, heal divisions, and build the resilience of groups and individuals. We can sort these kinds of positive narratives, as we'll call them, into the following three categories. First is alternative narratives, where we challenge the relevance of violent extremist narratives by instead offering more effective and nonviolent understandings of grievances, as well as approaches to addressing them. Counter-narratives, on the other hand, directly challenge, refute, or discredit violent extremist narratives by exposing the error of their ideologies, their theology, or perhaps by their framing of a conflict or local issues in a different way, and by exposing lies and hypocrisies of violent extremist groups, individuals, and ideologies. An example of this would be such as when ISIS claims to be fighting to protect the Syrian people, but are often and always instead committing horrible crimes against them. A counter-narrative would expose that hypocrisy. The third category is actually quite traditional. It's referred to as government strategic communications. These undermine violent extremist narratives by explaining government actions and policies in ways that refute the misinformation that they promote, and also reduces a lack of clarity. These are traditionally used by governments, but they can also be supported by any other institution. Let's look at one example of a unique partnership to encourage rebels in Colombia to drop their weapons and return home peacefully. As you watch this video, ask yourself what kind of positive narratives are being used and who partners together to make this campaign successful. You can watch this video by clicking on the picture on your screen. We can offer the following simple guidelines for implementing effective narrative campaigns. First, we should be sure to understand the relevant drivers in a particular area, and this helps us to see how these drivers might be effective and how violent extremists can be using narratives to promote their agendas. We should then identify the target audience that we would want to reach, such as vulnerable individuals. We should then identify the explicit or implicit narratives of violent extremist groups that end up resonating with that target audience, and then set clear goals or objectives in our own positive narrative campaign. Now, we may need to do that by determining which messengers in the community may have the greatest influence on that audience. Think of the last video, and think of how the mothers were likely much more effective messengers than if the Colombian military was simply offering that same message on their own. So, with those messengers and partners in mind, we should work together to develop the content and logic of the messages we want to share and how we would want to get that message out there. We might need to develop a strategy and how to do that and possibly connect them to countering violent extremism activities and projects that are already ongoing. And then after the campaign has begun, and even after it is finished, we should be sure to evaluate the campaign so we can assess its impact and make any assessments that may be necessary. It could even lead us to decide to continue the campaign. So let's look at another couple of examples of narrative campaigns that work to discourage radicalization or encourage disengagement from violent extremist groups. Click on one or both of the pictures on your screen to watch these examples, and as you watch them, pay attention to the messages that are being given and the manner or medium through which they are shared. As you consider using positive narratives in your programming, please consider the following good practices. First, we should understand that the messenger is often more important than the message. So we should ask ourselves who might have the greatest influence among our target audience. This could include asking, what are the existing and effective narratives that are already working to build resilience to violent extremism in a particular area? Next, we should be sure not to dismiss the grievances that violent extremists have, because they're often real, and they're often grievances that are also felt by the vulnerable communities and individuals that we would want to engage with. Instead, we should seek to really transform the way that these grievances are characterized and how we should respond to them from divisive and violent ways, and instead by promoting nonviolent calls to action in our work. We should also seek to reinforce community or religious norms instead of trying to discredit interpretations that may be exploited by violent extremists. Like many of the examples in the video, we can also greatly benefit by engaging a broad variety of actors in these kinds of activities. So in order to promote a do no harm approach, we should take care to understand that in some areas, governments may decide to prosecute those who share messages similar to those being shared by violent extremists, such as simply expressing grievances, rather than positively engaging with those ideas that are shared and those grievances that are aired, and offering alternative narratives and solutions. So this can be a risk in this kind of work. We should also be careful when studying violent extremist narratives, because in some contexts, the possession of violent extremist material can be illegal. In our own messaging, we should also be careful when using violent extremist content, because this can actually end up having the opposite effect we want to have by perhaps spreading violent extremist narratives or exposing them to new audiences. Another risk would be marginalizing vulnerable communities by making them feel that their values or perspectives are being attacked rather than listened to. We should also be cautious that using the wrong messengers can actually undermine our efforts and result in our programming being seen as propaganda. So as we complete this webinar, let's review the following key takeaways. As we've seen in this webinar, positive narratives come in many forms. This includes our understanding that they're not just media projects that you might see on television or hear on the radio or see on social media, but they're about words and actions and experiences and relationships even that shape our lives and our understanding of the world around us. We should understand that the effect that positive narratives uh, are having, that they can also already be helping individuals and communities to be resilient to the issue of violent extremism, that they're already present in local communities. So we should really seek to understand what makes them effective already. Next, we should be aware that there may be narratives that can help facilitate radicalization and division in communities that are being promoted by groups and individuals other than violent extremists themselves. That may mean that we need to also address things like conspiracy theories or hateful rhetoric. And finally, we should be sure to remember that messengers can be more important than the messages that are being shared. That's all for this webinar, but in the next video, we'll explore how to better leverage new media and technology in our efforts to counter violent extremism. Thank you.